Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast. We are here today with a book talk. We are going to talk about the book Literacy Foundations for English Learners by Elsa Cardenas-Hagen. And this book really prepares educators to enter the classroom with a full understanding, and we mean full understanding, of the language and literacy development of English learners. Melissa, I know this book is meaty and it's a lot, but it's meant to be a lot. So I want to make sure we say that up front. It's really important work, but it is meant to be like collegiate coursework.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Potentially.
So that's a really good point, because we don't want anyone, who says, oh, I have English learners, let me go get this book. And you are more than welcome to, obviously, but we just don't want you to get the false impression that, you can pick this up, read it in a weekend, and off to go. Like this is one that would take time. Like you want to set aside some really good time to really, read a chapter, think about it, study it.
For sure.
And
the best part is at the end of every chapter, there are questions that you can think about and answer. So it does lend itself to that like bit by bit approach. And that's how I read it. And it was really helpful and not overwhelming because, I took it a little bit at a time.
Yeah. And just for anyone that does pick up the book and might feel like I did, which was like, oh my gosh, this is this is a lot of information. It like you said, Lori, it is meant to be, right? This is actually, kind of geared towards college courses and like meant to be used it says an essential text for courses on literacy foundations and biliteracy, and an ideal in-service professional development resource. So it is a really, really solid book in that sense that it has so much information, but be ready for this to not be a quick read, but an in-depth one.
Yeah. Melissa, do you want to give us a breakdown of the book?
Yeah. And I was going to say, one of the things I also love about this book is yes, it's about English learners and how they learn to read, but even if you didn't know how anyone learns to read, this book would tell you, right? And that's where, it gives an introduction at the beginning of literacy skills for English learners, and then it just tells about language and literacy development, like from the beginning, like what happens.
That is so everyone. Easy to digest. That part is so easy to digest.
Really helpful.
It's really helpful overview, and I feel like the mantra that I kept repeating in my head the whole time I was reading this book, especially that part that you're talking about, that intro, was what's good for English learners is good for all students.
Right.
That's what I kept thinking. Oh. Yeah, this resonates. This is just literacy stuff.
Right. I was going to say like 90% of the book can be used for, unless you're talking about something very specific like cognates, right? Like that where you're talking about a different language.
Sure.
But so much of this is like, in fact, the rest of the book is each chapter is one of the components of literacy and English learners. So you'll get a chapter on phonological awareness, phonics, reading fluency, vocabulary, reading comprehension, spelling, and writing. And each of those is so in-depth on, like you said, general information for everyone. What is it? What do you need? And then you also do get tied in there some very specifics for English learners. But again, if you don't even have a background in any of those things that we just said, this book will give that to you.
100%. Yeah. And today, I think it's really awesome that we are going to talk about chapter 7, which is vocabulary instruction. And we drilled down to this one because we get some questions about vocabulary, and we felt like it was a topic that we haven't really talked about as much as we may have liked to talk about. So we thought we'd dig into chapter 7 about vocabulary instruction on today's book talk.
And because this book is so meaty, we can't talk about it all.
We can't talk about the whole thing. I don't even know we're going to get through chapter 7.
Nope, we'll just touch on chapter 7 just to give you a taste.
For sure. So I will start by sharing the objectives for chapter 7, which It's so fun. It makes me feel like we're back in the classroom.
Right?
Melissa, our objectives for today.
It's a college course.
It's a college
wrapped
course.
in a book.
Our objectives for chapter 7, integrated approach to vocabulary learning, embeds language development during content-rich learning. Makes me think of our Sonia Cabell. Scrabble. Yeah, Scrabble. Thank you. I say Scrabble first every time. Understand how word learning strategies enable English learners to become independent learners. Explore how content-rich vocabulary instruction builds a strong foundation for text comprehension. And learn and apply evidence-based vocabulary strategies. That sounds like stuff we'd be interested in as literacy people, regardless of who we're teaching.
Absolutely. Do you want to start by talking about, I love that term that she uses, which is content enriched vocabulary. Do you want to start by talking about what that is?
Ooh, yes. So teaching content specific vocabulary words that are used mostly in, she says, domain related contexts, such as ELA, math, science, social studies. They're words that kiddos should know to be able to talk, discuss, read, and understand content-related texts. How was that?
That was a great summary. Yeah. And I, like you said, it really does resonate with some of the other podcasts we've had about why knowledge building is so important. And it's for this reason, right? If you're pulling out all of those vocabulary words that, might pertain to the whole unit that you're studying, and they'll hear them again, and they'll see them in writing, and they'll be able to use them in discussion and use them in their own writing. Those are the words that we're really looking for here is, what are those key important words for this knowledge building unit or module that you have that you're teaching?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there is a little vignette on page 118. So if you have this book, you could flip to page 118. The vignette is really helpful in showing what this might look like in the classroom. And, they use vocabulary words such as transform, transformation, and it's all related to the topic at hand. So these are not words that are just randomly pulled. They are words that are embedded in that content discussion, which in this vignette is really, I think, kind of based in social studies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of the other words they pulled out were immigrants, migrants, transform, culture, and the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm trying to see what they were studying. Like going back, what was the topic of this?
They were studying
movement in
our world, and which highlights the impact of food on history.
Gotcha. Now it's making sense.
Really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
The thing though that, pulling out these vocabulary words and teaching them and having kids work with them and practice saying them and using them, it makes me think about, and I loved how this chapter shared this, but it makes me think about, what does it really mean to know a word? Yeah. Do you want to share a little bit about that with us? Like, what does it mean to know a word?
I do. I love that because it feels like, I remember taking quizzes in middle school, right? It's just like, if you can tell me the definition of this word, then you know what this word means, but like not really. So I thought that was really interesting. So there's a lot of like nuance to it, right? That if you have to know how to use the word in a sentence, right? Like you have to know how, sometimes you hear people like use a word and you're like, that's not quite how you are supposed to use that word, right? Like that's what we mean. Like it's not used that way, but you can use it in different ways too, right? So that you can take transform and make it into transformation because you understand how that word works. That you also know like synonyms of that word, and other words that are related to that word. So it's not just knowing what that one definition is, but it's knowing it deeply so you can use it in the right way, in different ways, and really make sense of it.
Yeah. I loved that it talked about it as a subcomponent of oral language. I thought that was really important. If we can use it orally, then we can it's that's part of language development, which I think we all know. And using it orally is the first step. before taking it any further. So I thought that was really important as well to note.
For sure.
Yeah. So when we think about vocabulary and the development of vocabulary, let's think about where it begins and maybe some similarities and differences between home and school. You want to start us off with that?
Well, I think you answered where it begins, which is at home, right?
Home, obviously. Yeah.
Obviously. Right. And we talk about it all the time.
In the womb.
Is there a study on that? We should look. I doubt it. But you're even if it's not in the womb, right? It's right after, right? Like they're hearing words as soon as they're born, or maybe before. I don't know. We have to do that research. But so early, Elliot is 3 and is just picking up words constantly from some of it is from reading. Sure. Some of it is from books we read. Some of it is from just us talking about things. Some of it, he comes home from school and I'm like, where did you learn that word? Like, where did that come from? Like, oh, here's one. He started calling like a tractor trailer, like the big trucks, he started calling them a lorry. Have you heard that before? Which is funny because it's your name, which is,
no, I haven't heard that because I don't know about trucks.
It's like a British term for the trucks. I have no idea where he got it from. I don't know if they watched
like Thomas.
Maybe we don't watch that at home, but maybe he watched it at school. I don't know, but it's like, they're so funny how I'm like, where did you get that from? So anyway, what I'm trying to say is like, yeah, you pick up vocabulary from so many different sources, but it's mostly oral. It's obviously all oral when they're that young.
Yeah. What I like to think about is, and I think any parent out there listening might be able to relate to this, is how your child tends to, over time, say the words that you say often. Like they start to sound like Presley uses, I must say, actually a lot. And I do say literally a lot. And there are words that like when she says them, I'm like, oh, that's so funny. I must say that a lot. And it's usually in the same intonation that I would say it. So it's the verbal environment that she's in. And she, goes to school with that verbal environment in mind and then takes that to school. And I think it's important to note that students arrive at school with differences in, as they note in the book, both the breadth and the depth of their vocabulary knowledge. Mm-hmm. And what I thought was really important and a key takeaway for me from this chapter was that native language support in the home should be prioritized and encouraged as our English learners engage in conversations, like using the code switching and cultural, they say capital. I don't know how else to say it any better, but their native language should be prioritized in vocabulary development. And I think that to me, that makes a lot of sense. I'm not going to ask a child to say something in a language that they're unfamiliar with before they can say it in their native language. That was my key takeaway. Do you think that that's like the right kind of way to interpret that?
I could see, I don't know, maybe a parent or maybe a teacher who was like, oh, well, if your real goal is to get them to learn English, why not just prioritize and focus on the English vocabulary, right? That's what we're trying to build here. So I think it is, like you said, it's a really good point to focus in on building their vocabulary in their home language. So they have something then to like, oh yeah, I hear my mom talk about this thing. I know what that is in Spanish. So now when you tell me what this is in English, all I have to do is connect that it's this other word that I already know,
For sure.
So I think that can get lost easily though, if people are so focused on the goal of learning English that they might lose that, like, don't forget to build the vocabulary in their home language.
Yeah. And I mean, I know we didn't do this exactly in the way that we're saying because it wasn't another language, but we just did this moments ago when you said, do you know what a lorry is? It's something that, because I knew what a truck was, I could connect that. But if I didn't know what a truck was, that would really mean nothing to me. Right. And I know it's not another language, but it's a very basic example of another place having a different word for something that we can attach with the schema that we know, which is truck. But if I didn't know what a truck was, I'd be really lost right now.
Right. Exactly. You'd be like, this is still an abstract thing. I'm going to forget it in 5 minutes. You
Right,
probably will
right in a
now,
minute.
especially because it's called a Lori,
My
you'll
name.
probably remember it. Next time you hear that, if you're like in England and someone says Lori, you'll be like, oh yeah, I remember.
Of course.
That
I'm going to go to
conversation with
England now and
Melissa.
see if Elliot wants to join me. Yeah. So I think there are, when we're teaching vocabulary to our English learners, there are 3 principles that we want to remember. And the first is, again, I think we just did this, build vocabulary knowledge by combining new information with what the learner already knows to produce higher cognitive learning. So essentially connect to the schema, connect to what they already know so that we can then build on that. And that is that, to me, I think of that like the foundation.
Yeah. Yep. And I mean, and that makes perfect sense, right? Is you don't want to go in and as if like they have never heard of what a truck is and just say like, here's a lorry, here's the definition, memorize it, right? Like you want to get them to connect it to something. And that's why one of the suggestions it's not just about using visuals, but they do use visuals to depict the characteristics of some of the vocabulary words. Their words are twig, branch, and woods. So to show the difference between those words. So visuals can be very helpful so that, they can connect it to something maybe they've seen if they don't necessarily have a word for it.
Right. And in that specific example, that kind of preview activity, like you just mentioned, right? Like previewing those related words related to what they're about to read is that takes place before they read and discuss a book called Owl Babies, which is a text about an owl family who lives on a tree branch in the woods. So you can see how that's related. It's connected. And what I also like take a small note in my brain is, all right, that doesn't take like the whole time either. It's still like best practices for ELA. We're not taking the whole time to learn these words. We're still getting to read the text and talking about the text. We're just previewing some vocabulary that's going to be helpful in a way that is strategic for all learners, but especially our English learners.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
So what's the next number 2?
example? Yeah.
All right. Number 2 is integrate multiple opportunities for using new vocabulary to make connections to concepts and lived experiences. So we kind of mentioned this before too, right? Of like this vocabulary instruction should not be limited to, I don't know why I keep coming to this book in my head that I had in high school that was my vocabulary book. And that's what I keep thinking of was like, it was a totally separate, like we had vocabulary time, we took a vocabulary test, we did our vocabulary homework all in this book. And it really shouldn't be that way, right? This should be part of instruction in all content areas. And we should be, using these words as students are discussing, using as a teacher, using those words as you're talking to the students. They should be using those words in their writing. They should be seeing them over time. So it's not just a one day you see the words twig, branch, and woods, right? But they should see words like that, related words for a while so that they can make connections. It should be ongoing and connected.
Absolutely. That your example of the vocabulary reminds me of the one thing that drives me crazy, not the one thing that drives me crazy, which is when we talk about spelling and we have like spelling lists or assessments that are disconnected from what's happening. It's like, well, here's this list of words. And, I don't know that happens as frequently as maybe it did in the 80s and early 90s when I was in school. I hope not. But your vocabulary book reminded me of that really the key word here for me, like you just shared, is integrated. Integrate those opportunities for using it. And if we are going to have, vocabulary experiences, spelling experiences, whatever they might be, there needs to be an application so that it's useful and it's not like a one and done. And that's what I think is really important here is that we're, it's very cyclical in this example that they give, the instructional application. We start here and then we come all the way back full circle to make connections, to having lots of opportunities within the purpose for using these words.
Absolutely. And this is reminding me, I know we talk about this with Elsa a lot when we podcast with her, so you'll hear it from her, but that this should not just be happening in your English language arts block or your literacy block, whatever you call it, right? Your science and social studies and math and whatever other content areas you might have are just rich with vocabulary. So these activities that you're talking about should be happening in all of those content areas.
For sure. And we love that. Big content rich fans.
Of course.
Yes. All right. So I'm going to share the third principle for teaching vocabulary to English learners, which is integrate intentional opportunities for language interaction around new vocabulary during content learning. And when we think about what that could look like, the instructional application example that is given is during a science lesson on, say the seasons, the class participates in an activity and the teacher shows 2 visuals that depict the 4 seasons. The teacher asks what's the same or different about the 2 visuals, and the class takes some time to what I consider like notice and wonder about them, right? They describe the visuals. And then the teacher actually expands on what the class says by providing more information and introducing vocabulary in that moment. And that, again, is an integrated opportunity for adult-child interaction and for the adult to model and introduce strategically that vocabulary around that content learning. So again, the content is the focus and the vocabulary is supportive of understanding the content.
And you know what I love about all of these, when you read the whole chapter, like everything is very strategic, like choosing the right words to have these discussions about. But when they're actually like the description of the discussions they're having feel like they would be natural conversations, like the same conversations I'm having with Elliot about what a lorry is, right? It's like we're just having that natural like conversation about what that word means and like being curious and getting kids to be curious about what the words mean and letting it be, again, not a separate vocabulary time, but like part of it and part of the whole discussion. And I don't have another word besides natural. It just like feels like it would be like how about organic? A really organic conversation.
I was going to say authentic. We could keep going there with synonyms. That is so funny. Well, one thing I think that I'm thinking about is any educator listening who might be feeling pressure, because I sometimes am like a perfectionist and I feel the pressure of, oh my gosh, what if I don't know what word to choose? What if I choose the wrong word? All these what ifs. And I think my advice after reading this chapter would be choose a word and try it. Choose a few words and try it and see what happens. I think that by trying it, our students will lead us and help us in knowing what words to choose next time. Yeah. And the benefit is they'll know some more words. Like there's really no like negative from this. Like, they'll know some more content words connected to what you're doing. They'll be able to have experiences in talking to the teacher, to other students and practice, and then they'll practice writing and they'll practice seeing them in text and reading. So it can only be beneficial. And I would just say, like, don't be afraid to try. And just try it. Just do it.
Yeah. And I think what you said about like letting the student, like if students ask about a word, like, all bets are off. Who cares what I planned? Like, let's talk about that word, right? Like if you're curious about what that word means, let's have that conversation. But I also have, I can share this with you, Lori, a resource from Student Achievement Partners, or Achieve the Core. It's called Academic Word Finder. And I find,
I love that one. I love that one.
When I'm planning and I just have like so many words and I'm like, well, my gosh, like where do I even start with this? I like to put it in there because it feels like it gives me a good starting point of like grade level. Like it tells you about what grade level they should know those words. So you're like, okay, and it's not, you don't have to like, it's not an exact science. So it's not like, well, I'm teaching 3rd grade. This says 2nd. So it's off limits. No, it's just like, okay, well, they should know it in 2nd grade, but they might not. So like, we'll probably still talk about it. Or it's like, oh, that's an 8th grade word. So like, ooh, maybe we just don't need to stress about it right now.
Sure. Can you, before we move on, okay, 2 things.
First, what do you do?
Can you explain what it is? And second, I think we've shared this in a previous newsletter, but we will definitely share it. I'm making a note in our newsletter.
Yep. So when you go to it, it's just like a place for you to paste the text in. So if you have something where you can just like copy and paste it, you can copy and paste the whole text if you want. I oftentimes just like have my list of like, okay, I have a list of 20 words. That's too many. Let me put that list into here. And then you select a grade level. And then when you select the grade level with your list of words, it will show you which of those words are these academic words, right? So back to our first point of like, these should be the like content specific domain words, right? It will take off the words that are not really like that. So they're not, right. To me, it's like, well, then we don't need to worry about them quite as much. And then it will also tell you the approximate like grade level. Oftentimes though, it will say like 2nd through 4th grade, right? Like it's often a range. It's not, again, not an exact science, but it gives you kind of an idea. For me, it's more of a, it's like, oh, this is a really tough word. I might just need to tell them what it means and keep it moving versus like spending a lot of time trying to talk about what it really means.
Sure. Can you say the name of it again? Just for, I'm just picturing educators listening being like, I need to write that down and go look right now. I cannot wait for your newsletter.
Yeah, it's called the Academic Word Finder, and it's from Achieve the Core. If you Google those things, Achieve the Core, Academic Word Finder, you'll find it, but we'll also link it.
We will link it. I know we've linked it before, but we will link it again and make it very accessible.
Yeah, perfect. It's super helpful.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're in the nitty gritty of teaching vocabulary to our English learners, and we know the principles for our instructional design, but what strategies can we think about when we teach vocabulary to our English learners? I know there's a little bit in here about shared book reading, which is read alouds, which sounds very familiar to every teacher.
Do you want to talk about those for a second? Because they give some, I think they just give like some bullet points that were really helpful for like to think about as I think most teachers, especially in the elementary level, do read alouds, but some good like think abouts if you want to build vocabulary, especially for English learners.
I agree. Okay. So shared book reading, they say it's a well-known practice referred to as read alouds and storybook reading. I've never heard of it as storybook reading, but I've heard of it as read alouds. So that feels familiar to me. And they share some important points about it, which is shared book reading content. So again, read aloud content is organized by content-related themes or topics. They actually call it topic immersion. I love that. I know you love that too.
I like that term a lot.
Topic immersion. That's exactly what I've been thinking with knowledge building. Like, I mean, that's what we do with knowledge building and building knowledge. Yeah.
We should use that term more.
Wait, but I'm going to put a star next to it. It's on page 129.
So we talk about that all the time, but I also love that they talked about repeated readings of texts, right? So I think I hear that sometimes. I think we talked about it with maybe Julia Lindsay, where, sometimes I hear teachers say like, oh, well, the kids get bored if you read a text more than one time and they're pulling different books every single day. But there is a lot of, there's a lot of research that says how these multiple exposures to the same text really gets those new words and concepts really, it's when it gets mapped into their brains.
Yeah. And I feel like I would like to be bold and say if we're pulling different texts every single day, then you're probably not pulling the right texts. Because if there's not enough to talk about or to dive into again, then they might not be worthy of reading aloud. Remember, we want books that students can't read on their own read aloud. We want them to have rich vocabulary, exposure to, different kinds of syntax and structure and important topics that we want to are worthy of study. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, our texts need to be rich and filled with knowledge. So I think that's an important consideration.
Mm-hmm. And they give an example of a 5-day shared book reading scope and sequence. We won't love that. We don't need to talk about it, but just to give an idea, they say for 5 days reading the same book with a different focus each day. But that's their recommendation. Yeah. I love it too.
Another really important note here is the opportunities to use language to discuss really content related concepts. So science concepts, social studies concepts, and just really using that language for discussion. I like to think of that as an oral rehearsal or a preparation for writing. And that is so powerful, especially for our English learners, to be saying it, talking about it multiple times, lots of interactions, especially prior to writing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, we just said all of that, and I'm thinking like, those are all great for all learners, not just English learners.
I'm thinking I did all of these in my 5th grade classroom every day.
Yeah.
We did a lot of talking about text, a lot of rereading, a lot of close reading,
yeah,
a lot of topic building.
The one that is usually related more to English learners is the strategic use of non-linguistic visual supports. But again, like, you know, it's good for all learners too. That is not unhelpful.
Yeah, 100%. There's just so much we could continue to talk about, but we are going to have to press pause because, I mean, we could go all day talking about this. Yeah. I think
we said we were just giving them a taste. So
this is just,
I think we did that.
7.
Just a taste.
Yeah. I mean, and I also want to say there's some really important and helpful visuals in the book that we are not able to illuminate on this podcast. So, you know, if you do have the book and you are listening to this podcast, check out chapter 7. You know, the visuals, the tables, all of the different figures happening, and especially the study questions at the end. They're really helpful to be a reflective thinker and studier of how to best support English learners with vocabulary instruction.
Yeah, and there's not even just study questions, but then there's extended reading and application activities, which are really cool.
Love it.
I mean, pages and pages and pages of references. So if you want to learn more, there's plenty of opportunities to learn more.
We could really geek out here in vocabulary for quite some time, but we'll have to bring it together, bring it to a close.
And also I don't even think we said that. Did we say that we podcasted with the author, Elsa Cardenas-Hagen? Did we say that?
We did not say that, but we did podcast with Elsa, and Elsa's podcast will be out right after this.
Yes. So you'll hear from her and her take on everything that's in this book. And
how did we forget that? Because it wasn't in our notes, Melissa. I didn't write it down. That's why.
That's okay. That's okay.
Well, I'm so glad we got to talk about this small bit of this fantastic book that is really an incredible resource for educators, especially those who are supporting our English learners. So thanks for having the conversation with me.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Thanks for listening, literacy lovers. We release a new podcast episode every Friday and share more resources in a newsletter on Tuesday. Sign up for our newsletter at literacypodcast.com. Each week, you'll receive important information, resources, and connected content.
We're excited to create a space for community discussion about our podcast. We want to connect with our listeners and support you in answering your questions. But we also realize there are a lot of other educators out there who have great advice and experience too. Let's keep learning together in our Melissa and Lori Love Literacy podcast Facebook group, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
If the content in this episode helped you, share with a fellow educator and teacher friend. Our literacy lover community welcomes educators at every stage of their learning journey. We're so glad you're here to learn with us.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of the Melissa and Lori Love Literacy podcast in this episode are not necessarily the opinions of Gray Minds PBC or its employees.